Welcome once again, everybody, to episode 4 of the Unlearning the Activist Script series that we concocted together with Anthea Lawson, a writer, activist, and seasoned veteran in various social movements. The kind of launch pad for all of this was Anthea's first book, The Entangled Activist, that started looking at different tendencies, archetypes, pathologies, blind spots that various sides of movement building spectra reflect, and what we can learn from them if we engage with this material. So today we're having a slightly different narrative thread on our session on hero culture and heroism. Something that's rather pervasive and rather, I would say, insidious in the way it manifests in our political work. And our guest today is Sophie Strand, writer and speaker, and compost heap, which The Flowering Wand, Rewilding the Sacred Masculine, and The Madonna Secret are two incredible works that I highly recommend. And yeah, over to you, Anthea. Heroism, here we go.
Thanks, Ivan. Hi, everyone. I'm Anthea Lawson. My pronouns are she and her. Thank you for coming. Thanks for being here. And those of you who've been to any of the others will notice that I say this each week before we even start thinking about how we might do our activism a bit better. I want to say thank you for what you're doing already. We don't often appreciate ourselves and what we're doing enough, that we're doing it at all, and it all needs doing. So thank you. Now, we're here looking at what I've started to think of as an activist script. It's not so much that it tells us the words to say, but I think it does tell us something about our role. And we make a load of assumptions based on the script and what it says about our roles. It puts us on certain tracks that are those of the dominant culture that we're in and that we're perhaps trying to change. It's easy to think that we're separate from that culture. We're activists. We can see the problems. We've got an analysis of what's going wrong. Unlike everyone else, we're trying to do something about it. We're not part of the problem, are we? I've been thinking about this for a few years now. I started out as a journalist. Then from 2002, I was a professional campaigner, although I'd been going on marches and protests as part of the anti-globalization movement for a few years before that. And my work in NGOs was trying to shut down tax havens and the arms trade. I was hassling logging companies involved in deforestation, oil and mining companies. I was using my training and experience as a reporter to find stuff out, do investigations, present the findings, run press offices, go and advocate with the findings. And I started noticing something, which was that we were doing things that were part of the problem. We were working in capitalist sort of ways that led to burnout. We treat each other badly, even though we were arguing for human rights. We were assuming that people might respond to facts, which is the same assumption that classical economics makes. And so, to cut a long story short, I stopped what I was doing full time, at least, and started interviewing other activists and campaigners and realizing that it wasn't just me going mad noticing this. There was something to talk about, and ended up writing The Entangled Activist, which is the story of how I came to see that we're not separate to the problems we're trying to change, and that's not always an easy recognition to hold. It's not trivial to acknowledge this, because mainstream culture tells us that we are separate, that we're individuals. We can choose how we live. We're above nature. We're individual operators. And it goes against activist culture as well, which tells us that we're good. We're the good ones. So we're not part of that mess over there, those people over there who we want to change. So with this new series of events, I wanted to go a bit further. I wanted to look at how we can recognize when we're adopting certain roles and running these assumptions. How can we start to notice, and how can we do it differently? First of all, we have to see how the script is shaping our approach. So we looked in the first session at, we know the answer. We might think our way of knowing is superior to somebody else's because of how we're educated, because of class, because of whiteness, because of gender. We looked at how we can get attached to being certain, and how we might soften that. In the next one, we looked at urgency. It's urgent. The tasks out there are urgent. Well, of course they are. Yet if we go at it urgently, if our nervous systems are activated, we're cutting ourselves off from our ability to listen well, from good strategy, from our connections with other movements. And we looked at how we might stay settled enough in ourselves to keep the connections. Then last week, we looked at we must make things perfect, and how our judgment of ourselves is connected to our judgment of others. and how this, again, risks polarization, it risks breaking movements and opening up rifts that can be exploited, including by the far right. We looked at how we can soften the judgment of ourselves. So today we're looking at this feeling that we need to be the hero. The hero is trying to save the day, trying to save the world, and the activist often is too. Now, as is the case often with writers whose work I love, I feel like I've been in conversation with Sophie Strand for longer than I actually have. I'd seen some of her poems in Dark Mountain, where I'm an editor, and I'd love them. But it was when I read The Flowering Wand, Rewilding the Sacred Masculine, and I found myself running out of space in the margin to scribble all my comments and questions. I was like, oh my goodness, I've got to get in touch. I really want to talk because you've been thinking about some of the questions about the hero that I've been trying to grapple with for a couple of years. And Sophie was bringing in nearly a decade's study of myth and ecological storytelling practice to her thinking. She's bringing some very, let's stick with the compost metaphor, some rich and lively and funky compost. So look, before we start our conversation, I warned in the last two events that in order to look at some of the deep societal stories that underpin some of the instructions on the activist script, that we might need to turn away from activism a bit to go into how the stories work, but then we'd sort of come back and connect it with your daily practice. And hopefully we managed to do that a bit in those events. This one may be a little different. You may see some of your own hero tendencies and how you can do things differently. It's not that you won't, it's just I don't want to guarantee or promise an instant takeaway, as capitalism has promised us that we deserve. Because to look at the hero, we need to go into quite deep mythic territory and its connections to the deepest parts of our psyches. And of course, the two are connected. I've heard the British myth teller, Martin Shaw, say, he's probably not the only myth teller to take this view, that what's so wonderful about myth compared with psychology is that psychology in its Western individualized form takes us sort of down into ourselves, further into ourselves, with all the potential constraints of that move. Whereas myth lifts up our individual concerns and connects them and us into something much wider and older and more shared. So what we're going to be talking about this evening may be very old stories and why their patterns matter. And so what I want to say before we begin is if you find yourself feeling a long way from your daily concerns and some of the practicalities of your activist work and your questions about it, hang on in there. Enjoy the ride. You've got an hour and a half of not having to attend to your usual tasks. We're not always going to be in the literal. It might be in the form of glimmers and threads to notice and pull on later. Stay with the feelings that come up. Give yourself some time in the next couple of days, if you can, to go and sit somewhere quiet. I mean, I would say under a tree. It's pretty damp and muddy and cold out there in the Northern Hemisphere, at least at this time of year. Maybe it's a walk, maybe it's on the sofa, but to reflect on where this is landing for you. And next week, we'll kind of come back round to some of these aspects of the saviour and some quite practical tools. Okay, so we must be heroes. Like, as with all these instructions on the activist script, as I see it, there's a sort of whisper of truth. In the UK at the moment, there are two men, Morgan Troland and Marcus Decker, who are serving a 3-year sentence and a 2-year sentence, respectively, for climbing very high up on a motorway bridge over the Thames estuary and sitting up there in hammocks holding up the traffic as part of a Just Stop Oil protest against new oil extraction. And their sentences are some of the longest for protesters in the UK under our horrific new anti-protest legislation. I mean, I think that's heroic, right? So welcome, Sophie. Can we talk first about what we're problematizing when we're looking at the hero? Because it seems there's acts of what we might call everyday and sometimes astounding heroism going on, and we're up against big targets. You know, maybe dragon slaying narratives have their place. We're not quite saying don't do heroic things, is it? What is it about the hero we want to dig into here?
Well, just thank you for a wonderful introduction and invitation, and for everyone here for allowing this compost heap into a space that they might not usually be invited into. So thank you. I am interested in, so I want to pull back a little bit farther and talk about the word hero and talk about the idea of the heroic individual, heroic epics, heroes in a longer mythic history. We do not really see heroic characters in iconography, in art, or in literature until relatively recently in human storytelling. And I think we are always backforming our present paradigms, our present perspective on the past. But the truth is that there were very different ways of being and thinking and believing. And it's important not to project backwards. Up until, at least in Europe and the Mediterranean, up until the Bronze Age collapse, the biggest thematic through line are the lack of human individuals in general. I oftentimes joke with people that we've kind of fetishized the goddess figurines, when the truth is that the biggest preponderance of images are not even goddesses, they're animals. And they're not singular animals, they're polyphonic constellations of animals, they're ecologies. And so the biggest, we can't, of course, reconstruct these distant religions, pantheons, mythic systems, but we can look at the artifacts they've given to us and their inheritance that for tens of thousands of years, so for so much longer than our relatively short civilization, it was ecologies, multi-species collaborative experiences that were heralded as sacred, as important, as needing to be remembered and made into art. And it's really only at a very important pivot point after massive climate change, drought, genocide, dislocation, that we see the rise of the heroic individual. This is really encapsulated in the work of Riane Eisler, who wrote The Chalice and the Blade, which is a great book about the movement from partnership, nature-reverent cultures to dominant imperial, like dominator cultures. I like to oftentimes say dominator because patriarchy feels a little bit like a simplistic trick at this point, because we're all complicit. And I don't think it's really it's big enough. It's more about, we're all inside of a dominator culture. And what is a dominator culture? A dominator culture for me is a heroic culture. And the hero is the species of human beings. It's the moment we think that, I always tell people that we are one of the youngest species on this planet. We're one of the youngest species on the planet, and we have the hubris to think that as the juvenile, as the 2-year-old on this planet, we might possibly be in the savior position in any sense. We have such short lives when compared to microbes and trees and mountains and ecosystems and even sharks and turtles. We've seen crabs have a much more stable, durable mode of being. Microbes have probably a lot more to teach us about sustainability, given that they had millions of years on this planet, keeping the dynamic homeostasis of the world in perfect order. So I oftentimes say, who are we to possibly think we would be the heroes of this story as the youngest species and the least experienced species on the planet, and as one of the only species that seems bent on destroying its own environment that produces its food? It's a pretty unsustainable habit. I wouldn't look at a species that did that and say, I would like you to be my role model. I'd like you to be my savior. And so for me, it's interesting that we see, with the rise of the culture that creates ecocide and empire, we see the rise of the heroic individual in iconography, art, and in heroic traditions that become the epic. I would still argue that the Odyssey and the Iliad are not heroic literature. I mean, I have a kind of off take on that, in that they're episodic and they're nested boxes and they're still part of oral culture that's adaptive and interchangeable, still an ecology of shifting species and beings. But out of a Homeric Greek tradition, you begin to see, with these dominator cultures, the reverence of human beings, human deities, men. The divides happen more and more. At first, it's humans from nature, then it's humans from other humans, men from women. The walls come up again and again. I would often say that the hero is a boundary. It's a way of keeping yourself morally safe. It's a way of saying that I'm special. I am somehow morally pure. And I'm very interested in impurity and how about what we can never. It's an interesting idea. So sometimes when people come to me and they're proselytizing veganism, this is one of my tacks I take. I oftentimes say, all right, that's fine, but your avocado has just as much blood on it. So or in your blood pressure stabilizers that you're taking, like, where do you draw where does your moral, universe end? How tangled is it really, to go back to Anthea's work? And so I'm interested in how heroism is really a kind of species-centric way of thinking. And we are, as the youngest species on this planet, it doesn't seem to be very ecologically wise.
I mean, you're basically saying, it sounds like why on earth would we expect the hero to be the solution when the hero arrived at precisely the point when the systems of domination that have ultimately led us to the point we're at now.
Well, it's interesting that you brought up these activists, because we do look for heroes. I mean, we all had these moments in our lives when we want someone to come and save us, and when we have been saved. And I mean, I think a question for you, Anthea, is: do you think that there's a gradient? Do you think there are types of heroic action that are necessary right now and are nourishing? I would love to complicate my own understanding of what this could look like.
So this is a really good question, and I don't have a straight answer, inevitably. I was listening to a really interesting conversation, a bunch of Jungian analysts discussing the hero and heroism, and they were drawing an interesting distinction, and one of them came out of kind of some activist work, I think. They were drawing a distinction between the hero sort of as a concept, as an archetype, as something that is, you know, in the collective unconscious, to use the sort of Jungian frame of thinking about that. And then it might be quite hard to totally disentangle ourselves from as a concept. They were separating that from heroic, you know, heroism, like as a sort of adjective describing perhaps a way of doing some, you know, and maybe that's a placeholder for bravery, for courage, for stepping up. You know, I think there's potentially something in that. I mean, what I'm just trying to think of, like, how I came to this originally. I was hearing, and it was gendered, actually, this discussion. I was hearing women involved in various activist movements saying, I'm tired of this, and the words macho and heroic kind of got put together. I'm tired of the way some of the guys are behaving. Now, this is not just men doing it. I don't believe that's the case at all. But it's something that can kind of get attached to a certain way of being that is often associated with that. And so I'm curious about how this, I'm curious about how the notion of the hero, like what it's doing, how it's working on us. Like, what is it it's telling us that we must do? Like, I really like your idea about boundary, and the kind of like part of it is kind of keeping us pure, because we kind of like step into it. And to me, that's when we, I mean, perhaps I'm riffing here, perhaps that's when we step out of our entanglement. We step out of thinking that we're part of things. Is that what you're saying with the boundary stuff and the purity?
Yeah, I mean, I think heroism always depends on a kind of God's eye trick that's not really possible, which is your ability to get a vantage point of the entire situation temporally from your own species and see all the different undulating contingencies and then decide on the best plan of action. And I think that we all have to do things badly. And I think that there are moments of urgency. I think there are moments of urgency where, like, someone is trapped under a car or someone's in danger, and you step into the role and you have to just trust that you're going to be a hero badly. Like, you can't see everything, but you're doing it. I think
we have to act. You're saying
we have to act. There are situations that require we throw ourselves into movement. But for me, I think what you're pointing to is this role of the hero, this way of becoming morally irreproachable by, you know, it's very, for me, it's always very bound up with theology and with kind of a Christian salvation idea that you won't get into heaven unless you adopt my way of being, that you won't be civilized unless you adopt my way eating and drinking and eating food and speaking. It's a way of homogenizing a moral universe. A hero in one culture might be a villain in another culture. So I think a hero is always perspectival. You're saving an animal from another animal, and you're depriving that animal of sustenance. That, to be a hero is to understand that it is always a shaky, flickering silhouette, that you're a hero to something and a villain to something else. And I think for me, I've had to recontextualize in my own life. So I think a lot about, do you know about the idea of Eucatastrophe, Anthea?
I feel like I've heard that word, but I don't really know what that means. So go on.
So I love Tolkien, and I love Tolkien's universe and his ideas about fairy stories and fantasy. So I've read a lot of him. I mean, I have issues with him and I grapple with him, but I also grew up with his work and loved it. And one of the things that he argued in this fantastic lecture that anyone can look up and read online called On Fairy Stories, and he also expanded this later in his conversations with C.S. Lewis, is that a true fairy story doesn't depend on like a god dropping out of the sky, like someone rupturing the order of events. It has to be incredibly natural. Like if something, it has to feel like it's not going to happen, not be depended on. And when it happens, it's absolutely the most natural outcome of all. It's not supernatural. And his example was the Golden Eagles coming and saving Frodo and Sam from Mount Doom at the end of The Lord of the Rings. And for me, what I've been thinking, and he calls that a eucatastrophe, which is it's like a catastrophe. It's like it's shaped by sorrow and by the knowledge that it could have been otherwise, and the knowledge that it's not underlining your belief in faith or God or magic. It's underscoring your idea that everyone could be a hero or a villain. Someone could save you or not save you. And for me, something I've been thinking about lately is what little acts of eucatastrophe can I enact in my life, rather than trying to create this big salvific program whereby I tell other people what they need and how they need to change their lives, and end up reenacting a kind of colonial mindset and impulse, which is I will take my view, my moral universe, and put it over your world. Instead of that, are there minor ways I can be the Golden Eagles? Can I see a slug that's trying to cross the road and just help it cross the road? And these acts feel small, but I actually think they show us that there's a type of heroism that's about finding our ecological niche. It's about weaving ourselves into a kind of interspecies collaboration that's small, that's unphotographable, and it doesn't show up on any kind of human schema.
Right. It's not going on Instagram, is it?
Yeah,
basically?
Exactly.
Because this is so much of what's going on with the hero is leaving Instagram out of it. You use the word colonial. It's a centering of ourselves and what we're doing, rather than a more participatory, collaborative approach, a more relational approach to what's going on.
And to let ourselves be. That's what you're going to say.
Sorry, yeah. So there's so many directions I want to go in at this point. So you mentioned Christianity and the Savior, and this is something I wanted to ask you about, because I've just recently read The Madonna Secret, your novel, about Mary Magdalene and reimagining Jesus's ministry from her perspective. It's absolutely stunning, and everyone should read it. And it feels like, as I saw it, it feels like she's trying to hold him back from kind of putting himself out there as the savior. She's trying to sort of put a brake on it. Is that how you saw it? It's almost like you wanted to stop him being the hero and sort of allow him to be something more sort of part of the ecology, which is where he had begun. Can you say a bit about how you were seeing that?
I think we always have to ask the question of narcissism. Right now, I've been seeing a lot of activism on social media that really seems to be narcissism. It's a dopamine hit. It's people posting their faces, victimhood by proxy, claiming the closest connection to someone who is harmed, and then using it to boost their own platform. It's narcissism. And for me, I'm really interested in how the character of Jesus, Yeshua, gets fascinated with the performativity of being a hero, and it actually removes him from the long sustainable drudgery of actually healing people for maybe 50 years. I always joke with people, like, how many more people could he have healed and helped if he had moved slowly and softly and just kept around and developed his ideas, told better stories, maybe gotten better disciples, changed his mind. That I'm 30 years old. I cannot imagine someone crucifying me today and then anything I've said somehow being wise. Like, I am at the beginning of my of learning and listening and thinking and digesting. And gosh, the fact that so much civilization has been based on the kind of reactionary storytelling of someone who was very upset and struggling to make sense of injustice and imperialism at a very young age in his life. It feels tragic, truly tragic. So for me, Miriam isn't keeping him from being a hero. She's trying to teach him how to be a real hero, which is the slow, not very shiny experience of being uncertain about your faith, wondering if you're actually helping people, wondering if there are better ways to help people, taking care of yourself, taking care of your friends, your family, pivoting, oscillating, making sure you don't burn out. He burns out. I think she's trying to keep him from burning out. He also pivots away from actually healing and helping people and becomes kind of, he starts to public speak and create these big, performances that end up being very dangerous, not just for him, but for thousands of years of other people.
Yeah, that really comes across. It's really, really moving. And the other thing I found really moving was where in the Flowering Wand you introduced this idea that really what's happened since then with his teaching is that we're missing the full cycle of composting. Like we're missing the returning to the earth. And
it's like we never grieved. I've often thought about it. It's like, because we never admitted that he was just killed in the prime of his life, and we've never just sat with the unsolvability of that, the terribleness of that, we needed to immediately turn it into a miracle and disappear his body and begin to co-opt his words. Instead, I sometimes think we should have to go back to the womb and just let the grief begin to do its work.
Right.
Yeah.
And it seems that side of that story that became so clear reading the way that you put it, that felt missing, like the decomposition, the earth, the feminine, death. It kind of fits with what I'd seen reading Jung about how, the Christ image as it became misses out on the dark side of things, and that was what was in the Gnostic teachings that had more of that. And so we've built an entire culture on just one side of it, and the shadow in every sense was put away.
Yeah, it's a real shame. I oftentimes say, it's what Empire does best is they'll kill someone, co-opt their story, translate it into their language, change it, and then use it as the masthead of their program. So much of what Christianity is today has so little to do probably with what that wild storyteller was actually trying to do. And it's sad. It's so sad to think about what would that group of people think about how those messages had reached us today by game of telephone. Like, how many mistranslations have happened?
Yeah.
But I also think it brings to highlight something that I've been thinking about a lot too, which is our idea that we are matter, and we are contextual matter. We live in a certain place. We eat food, we think and breathe and love and die in a certain place. And it's a certain perspective. We see the sky, the moon, the mountains in a certain way. And that makes us who we are. And who are we to think that our very encapsulated little nucleus of experience could translate to another culture, another place, another time? And I think sometimes one of the dangers of our global, world is that we think that translations happen easily and that the hero can translate. But I think that, as happens with Jesus, is the hero very quickly becomes the villain with just one or two, mistranslations.
Yeah.
I mean, a great example in terms of charity is what I always like to tell people is the words, one of my favorite mistranslations that happened immediately like within the first 100 years, was he says, blessed are the poor. In Aramaic at the time period, and in the earliest text we have, the word for poor he's using is distinguished from penia, which was, penia was kind of like holy poverty, like people who work hard, but don't have the class, you know, or the status to let themselves rise above a kind of drudgery. But the poor, the word for poor, that I forget what it was, it's some poor, some other word, Aramaic word for poor that Jesus probably used, was actually much closer to abject, complete, dirty, like homeless person, like drug addict. It was like equivalent to someone who is mentally ill, can't take care of themselves, and has been kicked out of every village. Big difference in words. So we have this very cute idea of blessed are the poor. And what he's saying, we have to translate it to our current universe and not forget the original language, which is, he's really saying is like, blessed is the crack addict, you know, blessed is the, you know, the sexual predator who no one wants to live on their street. It's really, that was the level of what he was saying. And I was interested in that, the ways we get away from his radical inclusion.
Yeah. Now I'm noticing an interesting comment here, which is one of the things I wanted to talk about. So I'm going to bring it in now, which is about leadership. Because I wonder if there's a link between what we understand leadership should be, and obviously there are lots of critiques of that, and there are ways of thinking much more about sort of, you know, sort of relational leadership and sort of ways of it sort of emerging from a collective and not just being a single person. Like how do you see that link?
Leadership. Well, it's a really interesting question. I don't think I'm totally equipped to answer it. I can try, but take it with a handful of salt. I mean, I think there are so many eusocial species on this planet. Like leadership is a type of technology that some species use sometimes. I think leadership is a technology that is sometimes useful. You know, sometimes you need the queen to create the pheromonal haze that creates a hive and tells each bee what to do. But you also need all the other bees, and you need the worker bee who goes and scouts out the new hive. And then maybe that worker bee is the leader, or who's the leader. And, you know, in a mycelial network that's fusing with other mycelial networks with no central node of cognition, with no even genetic stability, with promiscuity of species and typology, where's the leader? I think for me, we've become overly reliant on leadership and offloading our responsibility onto someone. You know, there's a great, this is kind of a weird pivot point and probably totally inappropriate to do, but if anyone here has seen Fleabag, I've been thinking about one of my favorite moments in the show, but I think it's a really brilliant show, where in the second season, she's not religious. She goes in to make confession. And she says, I'm just so tired. I'm so exhausted by this culture, this civilization, by grief. I just want someone to tell me what to wear and what to do. It's a really dangerous place to be in, is when you're desperate and you want a leader. And I think that our desperation right now for an answer oftentimes combines with our desperate need to have someone to tell us what to do. We want a parent. None of us are real adults. Our species isn't even an adult. And so I think that while we need leaders to do certain things, there are technology that are useful to get projects done. We need that. We also have to understand that we are not the leader species, and that it's not always the best way to approach a problem.
Yeah, as you were speaking there, I was thinking about Greta and the way that the press kind of holds her up as something, and it's inevitable the way the whole ecosystem around that works. But I sometimes feel like it's almost like she's occupying a sort of, not that she's taken it on for herself. I don't think that at all. It's almost the way that the world responds to her. She's occupying some kind of mythic role somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I think the example I always use in these cases is someone who I studied my whole life and I wrote my college thesis on was Joan of Arc.
Okay.
How she has the worst case scenario of this kind of falling into this type of role, and how we've we've kind of paved over her actual story, which is she did not want to be a martyr. She thought she would be victorious, and she thought she was going to go home. She thought you know, and that the night before she was killed, she lost faith completely. And she said to the priest, "Where will I be tomorrow?" And as a person who had said with complete certainty that she was always going to end up in heaven, that's a complete loss of faith the night before she's burned. And we're so uncomfortable with what happens to our heroes and our leaders ultimately. We eat them. I think it's a very terrifying thing to become a hero. I feel for someone like Greta because it's an unnatural amount of responsibility to hold. People are looking to her for the answers to questions she shouldn't have to answer.
Right. That's what I'm thinking, that there's a sort of giving up of agency in our
Not fair to
promotion.
her, I don't think. I mean, I think that young girls are going to be some of the wisest people right now? Probably. You know, they're still fresh. They can still see things clearly. They're filled with passion. Absolutely, I think people like Greta should be the people highlighted.
Right.
But there's a hagiography being built around her that can easily, on the flip of the dime, turn into a condemnation. That's the thing about our saints, is we often kill them.
Yeah. So look, I'd set myself a little thing I'd scribbled on my notes here, that by this point in the conversation, I wanted to ask you this question to make sure we leave enough time for it, which is, where are the glimpses that you've seen of stories that embody a different approach to the hero? You know, we've got this culture that turned towards it, and for a long time, that's been the basis, you know, the kind of the monomyth of the hero's journey, has structured a lot of the stories. But where are the glimmers? Where can we see interesting other ways of thinking about this?
Well, so I think I am always really touched and inspired by moments of accompaniment rather than solutionism. So I'm sick, and my illness has no cure, and it's not responded much to all of the solutions that I've tried and been given. People love to come and try and solve me. One of the things I'm most allergic to at this point is people who arrive and say like, "Oh, I've got you better in 6 months." And I'm like, "Ooh, that's awfully prideful. And also, I didn't ask you to fix me." So I'm always interested in when people have a much different approach to discomfort, when they can walk alongside it and be with it. And I'm always very inspired by that. And someone whose work I love and I've done a little work with is, and I'm sure you know them, Anthea, is Sam Lee.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And his work with collaborating with the Nightingales.
Okay.
Yeah, he's trying to highlight that they're going extinct.
Can you just describe very briefly what he's doing for those who haven't come across his work?
So Sam Lee is an incredible musician who's won many awards, has his own original music, collects folk traditions from all over England. I mean, he's done so much work that's incredible in many different musical arenas. But he's written a book and done this long project, which is collaboration with nightingales that are going extinct. And what he does is he brings musicians and artists and people to go and sing with them at night. And each year when he goes back, there are less of them. But he shows up and he sings and plays music with them every year. And it is heartbreaking and beautiful. And I think that we are so focused on heroism that we are not present with the beings that need to be saved, or not need to be saved, need to be acknowledged. We get so inside of our own journey and quest that we're not doing this collaborative work that is actually nourishing us and other beings. And yeah, he's highlighting the plight, but he's also very sober that probably won't shift the direction of things. I've talked with him and he's been very sober that the nightingales will probably dwindle and not come back some year, but he's going to make the most of this time of accompanying them, of collaborating with them. Oftentimes I think we create so many empty spaces in our species, so many extinctions, that there are birds that are singing love songs to mates that will never arrive. There are mutualisms that have been frayed. And so I like when artists step into that role of occupying the empty spaces that we have created. And so that's, I think, one of my favorite recent examples, is seeing someone do that. Yeah, I mean, in terms of stories, I'm trying to think of stories that have done it. And have
I'm thinking about the
complicated.
conversation we had before about Parsifal.
Oh yeah, Parsifal's my favorite, which is
That feels
Parsifal.
like an accompaniment, doesn't it? In some ways.
It does, exactly, which is he thinks he wants to be the perfect knight. He learns all the quote unquote human rules, the chivalric rules, and he goes out to get the grail. But lo and behold, the rules always work against him. They don't work in the more than human world. They don't work in the mystical world. They actually usually come across as being hubristic, as overly pompous, that he gets kicked out of the Grail Castle because he's so bent on his journey and his quest. It's very acquisitive. He wants to move along a linear trajectory, acquire the object, and attain his heroic valor. And it's only when he steps out of that story, of his own story, and returns to the Grail Castle and turns to the old king beside him who's wounded and says, "What ails thee?" that he finally opens up all of the narrative lint that allows him to attain the Grail. And for me, it's that moment when we turn to the side, out of our story, out of our species, out of our heroic individuality, to another being and say, "What ails thee? What am I not seeing? What's your story?" That we can begin to shift into more interesting conversations. And so I think for me, one of the things I'm trying to do every day is to ask the plants, the trees, the forest, the lakes outside of me, like, what ails thee? How can I best be of service to you today? Knowing that I can't take this as a blanket consent to speak for you or work with you. Like, I have to update it constantly. And
it's
so, yeah.
Relationship. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Are
what
there
I
ways...
really love... Sorry, go on. No,
I was going to say, are there ways that you dialogue with your community, with your kin? Like, what are your ways of checking in with the people you're working with?
Yeah, that's a really lovely question. I feel like I've been on a several-year process to shift. I mean, I was very honest about this in the Entangled Activist, and there's still more of this to go, to shift out of this savior mode that was so instinctive. It was a kind of fix it mode. It was, I can do something about this. It was bound up in the agency that I felt that comes with various privileges, among them being white, being middle class, being educated, that I thought, okay, I can get myself into these jobs. I can like whiz around doing these things. I can collect people's testimony. I can zoom straight over the Atlantic to UN headquarters in New York and present this stuff to the delegates and try and get a treaty, based on this testimony I've just found. I was absolutely in hero mode. Couldn't see it at all. I thought I was like doing absolutely, I had a sense of mission. It felt really strong, and I'm not working like that anymore. For many reasons, and one of them is it just became too uncomfortable. There was a real sort of dissonance to it. So now I liked your choice of the word alongside. That's what I'm trying to do. Is to ask, what do you need? How can I be of service here? Like what is it I can do to help, if anything? What's needed? And it feels like I often end up doing the same things. Like, what are my skills? I can write press releases. I'm really good at organizational campaigning strategy. I still do that for organizations. But nearly all sort of voluntary stuff now. But it feels different to be using those skills on that basis, to be using them on a basis where I'm somehow sort of centering more of me. That's why I really love that question in Parsifal, because it's emblematic, I think, of the shift to the shift out of the saving culture and into something more relational. It's at the heart of good political organizing, frankly. Actually, organizers, when they're doing their job well, even if they haven't got full lived experience that the community they're trying to work in might have, if they're on the level and alongside, and saying, right, well, what is it you need? Here I am, this is who I am, this is what I can bring, then you can have really brilliant coalitions. So it seems like there's a really sort of practical question there, but this is ongoing work. I still have to catch myself. I still check myself regularly when I found myself going, oh, right, well, I can do this then. It's like, well, did I ask? Did anyone ask for that? Not always.
I know. I read something recently and I forget who posted it. If I can remember, I will send it to you. But someone was talking about how we live in this very subtly violent moment where we feel like it is our role to educate other people who have not asked to be educated. And right. I think that the whole way people interact on social media is, you don't know it, but you're problematic and you don't know enough, and I'm going to try and educate you. And if you don't do it, you're canceled. And the truth is that education is always a kind of colonizer approach. It's always saying, I know best. You don't know enough. You're not enough like me. And that means that I get to treat you as less than, and I'm going to teach you. And then you have to value me as your teacher. And often to people who don't even know you and don't want to be educated. And I think that's something I've been thinking about with my own work. So we're talking about our skill sets. Like, I'm not a traditional activist. I'm a writer. I'm a disabled writer who has a hard time even leaving the house. But I still can sit on a pulpit. And I have to be careful not to be didactic and try and teach people who don't want to be taught, who haven't asked for it. And I think I've been really trying to tune into my own uncertainty and meet people in that field of unknowing, rather than trying to aggressively educate them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. This comes back to the first session we did on knowing. This like assumption that we've got the answer is all part of this package. And of course, as ever, there's a subtlety and a nuance to this. Like, I've learned loads from people who share knowledge via social media. You know, it's in, you know, there's so much that's bad, and there's so much that's opened up different communities of people to each other. Different knowledges, different epistemologies can be shared. You know, that's, you know, there is something good in that. But I think what we're pointing to is a certain attitude, a certain rocket fuel behind it that spins it into something else.
There is a difference between sharing and asserting and pushing.
Right.
Yeah, I think sharing right now is probably, we all need to potluck our ideas. I think, you know, instead of being heroes, I think we need to have big idea potlucks where we invite people from a lot of different backgrounds and we all say, none of us have the answer, but maybe if we put together a meal, something delicious will emerge.
I win.
Yeah.
That sounds great. Now, look, it's 5:02. We want to leave some good time for conversation and questions. Should we move to, you were going to do a little invitation for people.
Yeah, instead of, you know, after I wrote a long thing, but now after having said this, I feel like I don't want to read to you my my theories, and maybe I'll just tell it as a story.
Yeah. Which
is, and then as an exercise that if you want, you can practice in your own life. You know, I've been the worst culprit of this, which is when we're sick and tired and hurting, we want to offload our intuition into a guru or a teacher or an idea or a paradigm. And it can feel good for a little while, but how many of your heroes and gurus have been outed for sexual misconduct? I mean, like, I've had enough of these experiences to be a little wary of looking to human beings as my main soul of advice, my compasses. And not that I don't do it still, but I'm a little more hesitant to do it, to look for my heroes among the hominids. And I had this moment in the pandemic. So my whole life, I've had these big animal encounters that have redirected me. They've impacted me and changed me and changed the direction of my life. And like perhaps for a season, I'll see hawks repeatedly. They'll drop mice in front of me. They'll land on my car. I'll research hawk science, the evolution of hawks, mythology. I'll live inside them. And that's something I do. I try and say, like, okay, hawks are here to teach me. And I've been lucky that I've had a lot of sexy animals show up, cool animals, mountain lions, hawks, snakes. But at the start of the pandemic, my engagement had broken down and had a miscarriage. I was in a pretty intense moment of uncertainty and sorrow. And I really wanted a teacher. I was looking for somebody to tell me what to do. And I was lucky that it wasn't a light worker or a heroic individual, but the being that showed up were woodchucks, groundhogs, or land seals, I call them, as they dive in and out of the soil. They're so goofy. And I was isolating in this little neighborhood on the Hudson River, and I would walk hundreds of miles, but like in a 5-mile radius. So like a really tight spot of land. And on my walks, I would repeatedly have woodchucks run at me and like come up to me. At my sit spot, they came and started to sit next to me. I started to feed them carrots because I was like, well, okay, I guess this is happening. And I realized that they were teaching me a lot of goofiness, to not take myself so seriously, to not be so worried about my physical presentation, to kind of embody my physical comedic potentiality. They were really guiding me out of myself at a time when I could have gotten more and more solipsistic and, self-pitying. And so I spent a lot of time with woodchucks, and I started to think like, okay, so woodchucks are my zodiac that I'm living under. They're teaching me, they're my teacher. And I got a little high and mighty about that. I thought it was cool. I took a lot of videos of them. And I thought the woodchucks were here for me. And that they were my medicine, And I went, after months of these very comedic, weird encounters, I was driving home from seeing a friend for a social distance walk, and this huge storm came up, and I was on the highway, and there was like a guardrail and a dividing line and cars 70 miles per hour on both sides. And against that dividing line was a rain-soaked woodchuck. And there was no way it was going to make it in either direction and make it. It was going to get hit. And I didn't think. So this is like, heroism. Did not think. There was literally no kind of performativity involved. I just pulled over, put the car in park, jumped out, put my hands out like this. And anyone who knows wild animals will know this is extremely unusual. It jumped into my hands. Felt like an electrified loaf of bread. It smelled so intense. It smelled like urine and lemon, and like it was such a wild smell, so not domesticated. And I ran across the highway through these cars, almost getting hit, and like went like this, and it kissed my hand and dove into the greenery. And of course, some lady driving by was like, "Lady, that's the dumbest shit I ever seen!" Like, and I immediately said, "Fuck, fuck, fuck," because I knew that I had an open cut on my hand and it had licked my hand. And I was like, I'm going to call the DEC and they're going to tell me I need 10 rabies shots, which I did. I knew it. And I have bad reactions to vaccines and I knew I needed them. And I was like, oh, that was so dumb. Why did I do that? Like, I did not feel like, oh, that was so cute. I was like, that was terrifying and dumb. Why didn't I think about it? And then when I got home, I took a breath and I thought, oh my God, how self-centered have I been? Maybe my entire life was about saving that woodchuck. And maybe all these encounters were not about me and my pain, but about priming me to such a responsiveness to woodchucks that I would be so ready in this moment to help this woodchuck that I wouldn't think about it. I would just do it. And maybe I'm not the main character. I'm not even like a side character. I'm like a side character. And the main character is the woodchuck. And so a question I often ask people is, what being are you the side character of? Like, what encounters in your life, if you recontextualize them, are you just the side character helping another species? And what if your life what if that was the most important event of your life? I'm still not totally unconvinced. That was not maybe, it felt so intense for me. Like, it was one of those really intense moments of my life where I was like, it could have been that could have, in the butterfly effect chain that keeps this earth alive, that might have been the most important thing I did. I could think it was my books, I could think it was my relationships, but maybe it was that. And so, yeah, that's my question I'd love to leave people with. And if anyone has like a story, I always love to hear.
So the question is, like, who are you the side character to?
Yeah.
And before we open it up, I wanted to pause with recording so that people can feel more comfortable to share. In this story, I can also see the workings of some Tolkien effects, I would say. And I have to say that while you were talking, the more kind of pop culture reference I could think of is The Walking Dead, which is like a graphic novel series. So like in post-apocalyptic zombie Earth, you have all these new communities emerging, one of which called themselves the Saviors. And the Saviors used so many of the things that you touched on, including like violence and charisma, very traditional militarized leadership, a way of giving people just enough to keep them engaged, which was kind of a commentary on the fall of a lot of revolutionary heroes that kind of atrophied in their values after some sort of success. So this was quite, it's something that is also then turned from a graphic novel into a mainstream series. And so these narratives do appear in like very contemporary culture, just with different masks. I would thank you both, and I will pause recording.